Mr. Dean, Mrs. Neirynck, dear colleagues from Leuven and from several other countries, Canada, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Germany, and dear students. Many thanks, Professor Neirynck, for this kind introduction, and especially for the invitation to the KU Leuven to give the Franz Neirynck lecture in 2019. This invitation is a great honor for me, and I want to thank the Franz Neirynck Foundation and the Theological Faculty of the KU Leuven for asking me to give the lecture this year. The impressive work of Franz Neirynck is a great motivation for maintaining rigorous precision in analyzing New Testament texts. This dedication to the object of investigation is not only necessary in dealing with New Testament texts, but also in discussing problems of early Christian history, which obviously is closely connected with the earliest writings of Christianity. This is the field of research I want to enter with you in this lecture. And within this field, I want to discuss the problems connected with the collection prepared and offered by the Christian communities established by Paul in Greece and Asia Minor for the Christian community in Jerusalem. The origin of the collection. The year 49 was a turning point in the history of early Christianity. Besides the first Christian community in Jerusalem, several other communities had been established, especially in Phoenicia and in Antioch, but also in Pisidia and Lycaonia. In these communities, also people of non-Jewish descent were baptized in the name of Christ and thus integrated in God's chosen people. They were not urged to be circumcised or to respect Jewish purity rules. Christianity now existed on both sides of the border between Jews and non-Jews. But was this decision of the newly established communities to put aside the divine law, so deeply rooted in the Old Testament, in any way justified? To discuss these problems, the most important community outside Jerusalem, the community of Antioch, sent two of their leading persons, Barnabas and Paul, to Jerusalem in order to reach a consensus with the Christians in Jerusalem who naturally still lived according to the Jewish law. In my view, it is already remarkable that such a delegation was put together. The Christians in Antioch did not say, "Oh, we know that with Christ the beginning of a new age has come. Like other Christians, we have the Holy Spirit, and we do not need to ask anybody else if we want to make new steps in the new epoch that has begun with Jesus Christ. And if those in Jerusalem do not understand this, we cannot help them." No, in Antioch they did not speak this way. They wanted to discuss the problems and tried to find the common solutions. And the Christians in Jerusalem, they did not say, if those in Antioch do not understand the importance of the ancestral law, of holy traditions and divine revelations, we cannot help them. No, they did not speak this way. The delegation from Antioch came to Jerusalem and they were received in Jerusalem. And both sides tried to find a solution. There's now here no sufficient time to tell the whole story of that meeting, but at the end, the leaders of both sides gave one another the quotation, right hand of fellowship, Galatians 2, verse 9. That means the Jerusalem community accepted that the Christian community of Antioch lived outside the Jewish law, and vice versa. Second, they agreed in dividing the tasks concerning the proclamation of the gospel. They agreed, quotation, that we, as Paul says from his own perspective, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they, that means those in Jerusalem, to the circumcised. Galatians 2, verse 9. But it was clear that in consequence of this decision, the Christian communities within Judaism and those outside would develop in very different directions. For the future, there was only one single link between the communities they agreed upon: the obligation that the community of Antioch should, quotation, remember the poor. Galatians 2, verse 10. This means organize a collection in favor of the community in Jerusalem. This was a charitable action, but simultaneously it was an act of mutual acceptance. The Christians in Jerusalem, living according to the Jewish law, in accepting the financial support from Antioch, accepted that these other Christians lived outside of the law. And the Christians in Antioch accepted and respected the community in Jerusalem living by the rules of the Torah. Now I come to the preparation of the collection in 53 and 54 AD. Corinth and Galatia. In Galatians 2 verse 10, Paul assures that he was eager to fulfill the duty to take up the collection. In 1 Corinthians 60 verse 1, this is confirmed for the communities in Galatia and in Corinth. In both cases, he gave the same advice. The members of the communities should regularly put aside some money. The purpose of this advice is clear. The result should be a considerable amount of money. In 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1, Paul gives only this rather technical advice, but he does not inform the readers about the whole project. That means they had already been informed earlier, and the project must have started sometime previously. From from 2 Corinthians 8, verse 6, we know that Titus, one of Paul's co-workers, was already involved in the project of the collection in Corinth. So we can suppose that it was Titus who, on Paul's instruction, started the project in Corinth. If 1 Corinthians was written in the spring of 54, the project must have started in Corinth in 53. Next, Galatia. Finding out about the beginning of the collection in the communities of Galatia is a more difficult question, given the fact that the area in which the communities are located and the date of the letter to them are both heavily disputed in scholarship. The only fact that is clear is that the collection had already started when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 16. So there is a possibility that the collection in Galatia started in 53 as well. As I argued elsewhere, there are good reasons to assume that Paul's stay in Galatia can be dated to 53 if Galatia refers to the territory of Ancyra, Tavium, and Pessinus, east of the province of Asia. Then Paul would have started the collection immediately during his missionary stay in Galatia. The further development of the project in Galatia is unknown. In any case, the communities in Galatia were not part of the joint action of the communities in Greece and Asia. It is possible that the Galatians delivered their collection independently and without Paul joining their delegation. Even in the case of Corinth, Paul leaves it at the beginning, in 1 Corinthians 16, open whether or not he will join the delegation that will bring the collection to Jerusalem. So the same we can assume for Galatia. At this point, it is necessary to say a word about the importance of the collection for Paul. After his break with Antioch, Paul independently established communities in Greece and Asia Minor. These communities did not follow the dietary rules of the Torah. They did not pay taxes to the temple in Jerusalem, and circumcision was not mandatory for male members. These communities did not exist in 49 AD when the agreement between Antioch and Jerusalem was reached. So Paul, in starting the collection in 53, expanded the agreement to communities originally not included in the agreement with Jerusalem. Obviously, he was very interested that the communities he had founded afterwards were included in this act of charity that was simultaneously an act of mutual acceptance between communities. As we learn from Romans 15, this collection was Paul's last project in the East before turning to the West. It should lead to the full ecclesiastical relationship between the new communities founded by him and living outside the Torah, and the oldest community abiding by its rules. Bringing the collection to a positive end was therefore the last service Paul could do for these communities. Now we come to the difficulties. From 2 Corinthians 8 we learn that the collection that had started in Corinth in 53 had ceased in the meantime. Paul is urging the Corinthians to restart it, and in support he sent Titus and 2 other brothers to Corinth. It is not, however, surprising that difficulties arose. In fact, raising donations was a quite usual procedure in antiquity. People donated money for the decoration of a temple, the equipment of an assembly hall, or the repair of a street, but always for purpose in their own town, not for a group in a city far away. And as John Kloppenburg has pointed out, collecting money for people who were poor was unusual all the more. So it is astonishing that in Macedonian communities the collection made considerable progress. The only explanation is that Paul pushed this project with all his authority. On the other hand, 2 Corinthians 10 to 13 shows that in Corinth, for a certain period, Paul's authority as an apostle was heavily disputed. So the interruption of the collection in Corinth is not very surprising. Now we come to the preparation of the collection in 55. In the next year, in 55, when Paul wrote his letter to the Christians at Rome, the difficulties in Corinth apparently were overcome. He writes, Nuni te paroiomai es Jerusalem diakonon tois hagios. At present, however, I am going to Jerusalem in a ministry for the saints. Oidokesan ga Macedonia kai Achaia, koinonian tina poesastai, eistus ptuchus ton hagion ton en Jerusalem. For Macedonia and Achaia have pleased to share their resources with the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. Here, that is Romans 50:25. It's written there, yes. Here, Achaia, and this includes its capital Corinth, and Macedonia are expected to complete the collection rather soon. And then Paul continues stressing the spiritual bearing of the collection. He says, Oidokesan ga kai opheleta eisen auton. They, that means Macedonia and Achaia, were pleased to do this, and they owe it to them. Ega, tois pneumatikos auton ekononesan etne ophelusen kai entois akikois letu gesai autois. For, if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual gifts, they ought also to be of service to them in material things. Paul clearly assumes that the collection soon can be delivered, and immediately afterwards he wanted to go to Rome and then to Spain. Tuto ga epitelesas kais fragisamenos autois ton kapon tuton apelosoma dihumon espanian. So when I have completed this and I have delivered to them this fruit, I will set out by way of you to Spain. Romans 15 contains still another important statement, and it's very astonishing. We learn from Romans much more about the collection than from the correspondence with Corinth. It's worthwhile to think it over, the problem. But I will continue here. Romans 15 contains a statement which is of importance as well. He is talking about the dangers he has to expect in Jerusalem. In Romans 15:31, Paul urges the Christians in Rome to join his prayers. Hina Risto aporton apetunton enter Judea, kai he diakoniamu he is Jerusalem, ol prostectos tos hagios genetai. They shall join his prayers that I may be rescued from the unbelievers in Judea, and that my ministry to Jerusalem may acceptable to the saints. Here we learn that Paul was very well aware of the risks of going up to Jerusalem. And there were two risks. Paul had to reckon with attacks by Jewish activists. And he could not be certain whether the community in Jerusalem would accept the collection. Nevertheless, Paul is determined to go and to present the fruits of the collection. This again shows the importance he gave it. From the outset, there was no doubt that the delegation of the communities involved in the project should bring the collection money to the community in Jerusalem. 1 Corinthians 16. In 1 Corinthians 16, verse 4, Paul was still uncertain whether he personally will join the delegation. But in 2 Corinthians 8:19, he is determined to travel to Jerusalem personally. Now we come to the journey itself. As I have argued elsewhere, there are good reasons to assume that in Acts 20, verse 4 until 21, verse 26, Luke uses a report from a member of the delegation that went together with Paul to Jerusalem. This report consists of three parts: the list of the participants, the itinerary, and a report about delivering the collection. However, Luke does not say that this delegation went to Jerusalem to deliver a collection. He does not give any reason, neither for Paul's travel to Jerusalem, nor for the extraordinary fact that he is accompanied by at least 8 people. Later, in Acts 24, verse 17, however, we see that Luke actually knew why the delegation went to Jerusalem. There Paul says, according to Luke, in his speech before the Prefectus Felix, quotation, I came to bring alms to my nation. Quotation finished. But for Luke, another aspect is much more important. He depicts this journey as Paul's way to his martyrdom. Looking back, this is totally correct. But at the same time, we must say, originally, Paul did not go to Jerusalem to be arrested there, but he wanted to deliver the collection. I come to the first point of this paragraph, the list of the participants. There are 3 delegates from Macedonia: Jason, Aristeas, Secundus, Gaius, Sopatros, son of Pyrrhus, Aristarchus, Secundus, from Thessaloniki. Then one Gaius is mentioned, called the Derbian, who is probably Macedonian as well, judging from the position in the list, though the place of his origin is uncertain. The next is Timothy, Paul's well-known co-worker. At the end, there are 2 delegates from the province Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus, the latter hailing from Ephesus, according to Acts 21, verse 29. According to Acts 20, verse 5, these 7 persons, quotation, went ahead and were waiting for us in Troas. Quotation finished. So there are at least 2 further persons hiding in the V. Later on, these went from Philippi to Alexandria, Troas as well. And in 26, it is said that they followed after Passover. So the other had gone before Passover. The names of these persons are not mentioned. At the same time, it is remarkable that no members of the community in Philippi are mentioned in the list. Given the fact that this community always gave Paul financial support and that the whole delegation gathered in Philippi and there started the journey, there's all good reason to think that Philippi took part in the collection as well. So we can assume that the two participants hiding behind the B are the delegates from Philippi. And if they were the authors of the report they delivered after the return to their community, it is easy to understand why they did not mention their own names. They were known in the community naturally. Last but not least, Paul belonged to this group as well, and the whole delegation thus consisted at least of 10 persons. Here you see the whole list. At the same time, we must recognize, if you see this complete list, that one well-known Pauline community is missing, Corinth. And this despite the fact that in Romans 15:26, Achaia was explicitly mentioned. Nobody gives us a reason directly, naturally. But perhaps the Corinthians hesitated because of the difficulties that were to be expected in Jerusalem. But obviously, this is only a guess, not more. Now we come to the next part of the report. Luke is using in Acts 20 and 21 the itinerary. The journey started in Philippi. From Philippi to Jerusalem, it was a rather long journey, and there were 4 different parts. Here we see the first part from Philippi. The harbor of Philippi was Neapolis, to Alexandria Troas. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Second part from Alexandria Troas to Patara. Third part from Alexandria Troas to Caesarea Maritima. Last part from Caesarea Maritima to Jerusalem. The 3 first parts were sea voyages, but only for the last part from Caesarea Maritima to Jerusalem did the delegation have to go on foot. Let us now start with the first part of the journey from Philippi to Alexandria. The delegation gathered in Philippi. Here we see the Forum of Philippi. In Philippi, Paul founded his first Christian community in Europe, and Philippi remained his most beloved community. Can you see all the light is okay? Yes? As I already mentioned, the delegates traveled in 2 groups from Philippi to Alexandria, a Roman colony as Philippi as well. Here from Philippi to Troas. The travel from Philippi to Alexandria Troas took, at least for the last group, we have an information, 5 days, according to Acts 26. In Greco-Roman times, Alexandria Troas was a shipping hub in the northeastern part of the Aegean Sea, directly adjacent to the Bosporus, the difficult passage to the Black Sea. It was the last harbor between entering the Hellespont and going to the Black Sea, and this passage was very difficult in antiquity, and they had to wait, ships had to wait for favorable winds and conditions. So this was a very important harbor. Next we see the remains of the ancient bath that must have been an impressive building. These are the poor remains of the harbor. You see nicely ancient column, but the harbor is totally silted now. There in Alexandria Troas, the delegation could hire a ship going directly to the south. They were obviously successful, and after a week they could start the next part of the journey. Now we turn to the second part of the journey, the voyage from Alexandria Troas to Patara. It had 8 sections. Here we see the harbors, starting Alexandria Troas, then Assos, Mytilene, and Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Milet, Kos, Rhodos, Patara. The sections are at a distance of a single day's journey from each other. The ship sailed at daylight and anchored at night. In 4 cases, it is explicitly explicitly stated that the next section started directly the following day. And this applies to Assas, Milet, to Mytilene, Chios, Samos, and Kos. In the other harbors, Assos, Milet, and Rhodos, they probably had to wait for favorable winds. For such a stay, we can roughly estimate 1 or 3 days, between 1 and 3 days. As the ship was always sailing between the islands and with visual contact to the coast, we can assume that it was of limited size. Here we see such a ship. The picture is taken from a Roman sarcophagus. This ship went the shortest way to the south. You can control it if you go back to this map, and it's not possible to think that there was a shorter line if you go on the coast, always at the, along the coast. So it is very probably, in my view, that Paul was able to hire the whole ship, that he could order the captain or the leader to go the shortest way. Paul, according to Acts 20:16, Paul tried to arrive in Jerusalem before Pentecost. And we know why. Luke doesn't say, but we know from Romans afterwards he wanted to go to Rome. Therefore he was in a hurry. And it is, as I already said, probably that Paul and the delegation chartered the boat for the whole trip to go to the south as quickly as possible. Patara, the harbor at the end of the second part, is already situated at the open sea. And after leaving the Aegeus. Here we see the harbor, but today the harbor, as you can see here, is totally silted up. There were big storehouses for grain in Patara. The harbors at the Lycian coast, especially Patara and Neirynck, the harbor of ancient Myra, both harbors were very important for sea traffic in that time, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. Recent investigations have shed new light on the routes of the grain transport at that time between Egypt and Rome. One main route from Alexandria westwards to Italy crossed the Mediterranean Sea west of Egypt in northern direction, then ran to the west of Cyprus, thus leading directly to Lycia. And from Lycia, the route turned to the west towards Sicily and Italy. The importance of Patara and Neirynck is attested by the warehouses, probably for grain, erected in both harbors. Here we see the rather well preserved storehouse in Neirynck. The importance of the Lycian harbors is underlined by the fact as well that Paul, when he was brought 2 years later as prisoner from Caesarea Maritima to Rome, had to change in Neirynck to a grain carrier going to Rome, according to Acts 27. Therefore, we can conclude that Patara, the second harbor where the delegation had to change ships, was a hotspot of ancient sea traffic as well as Alexandria. There in Patara was a good chance for the delegation of finding a ship going east to Phoenicia. The ship they found was a cargo vessel, as we are informed in Acts 21, verse 3. Here we see such a cargo vessel. It is a mosaic from Ostia, the harbor of Rome, where such big vessels landed. These vessels were used by passengers as well. In Acts 21, no details are given about the ship, but as it was going across the open sea, it must have been of considerable greater size than the sailing ship they had hired in Alexandria, Troas, going directly from island to island in short steps in the eastern part of the Aegean Sea. Now we come to the part Patara to Caesarea Maritima. The journey from Patara to Phoenicia was a voyage across the open sea and took several days. And they had to now to sail day and night. They passed on the south of Cyprus, as it's stated in Acts 21, verse 3, and the first harbor in Phoenicia was Tyros, today Tyre in southern Lebanon. Here we see the Palestine and Phoenicia coast. In Tyros, the ship stopped for 7 days to unload cargo, Acts 21, verse 4, and Paul had to wait, despite the fact that he was in a hurry. But naturally, he could not hire such a big ship as he could before with a little one. After a stop of 1 day in Ptolemais, also known as Akkon, north of Haifa in Israel, the next harbor they reached was Caesarea Maritima. Caesarea Maritima, named after the Emperor Augustus, was founded by King Herod the Great, using the best up-to-date technology of his time. It was a splendid Hellenistic Roman town with theater, arena, temples, and sufficient water supply, and a big harbor. Most of the inhabitants were non-Jews, but there was a Jewish minority as well. Caesarea was the residence of the Prefectus Judea. Here you see the map of Caesarea Maritima, and you see the typical Roman grid of the streets, the big moles, here the big moles, the grid here, the big moles, the arena, the theater, the palace of Herod, directly at the coast with a big swimming pool, and the temple for the imperial cult. Here we see the arena during the excavation in the year 2000. And we see the harbor. Most of it, the harbor of the moles are now underwater, but it's still visible that there was a harbor in ancient times. It was still used in the times of the Crusaders. So long it was possible to use it. And we see here the aqueduct, 12 kilometers long, bringing from 12 kilometers away water to the town. There was no spring at the whole coast for the whole town. All water must be come to the town by this aqueduct. So you can see how Herod the Great was a great builder in his whole kingdom. Now we come to the stay in Jerusalem. In Caesarea Philippi Caesarea Maritima lived Philippus. Excuse me. In Caesarea Maritima lived Philippus, called the evangelist, who was one of the 7, meaning that he belonged to the group of Stephen, the first martyr. He had 4 daughters who had the gift of prophecy. As we learn from Acts 21, verse 16, there were other Christians in Caesarea as well. Philippus, therefore, we can safely conclude, was the leader of the Christian community there. Paul had visited this community some years earlier, according to Acts 18:22. So he was most probably personally known to Philippus, and the delegation could stay there. Then we hear of a dramatic turn. A prophet from Jerusalem named Agabus arrived. He took Paul's belt, and in a symbolic act known from Old Testament prophets as Jeremiah, he bound his own feet and hands with Paul's belt and said, quotation, "This says the Holy Spirit, this is the way the Jews in Jerusalem will bind the man who owes this belt and hand him over to the Gentiles." Acts 21, verse 11. What had happened? Obviously, the Christians in Caesarea had sent to the community in Jerusalem to announce the coming of Paul and his delegation. And the community in Jerusalem was upset. For heaven's sake, they said, this is naturally not reported by Paul here, by Luke, you see. For heaven's sake, they would have said, we have enough problems with hostile people here. This would cause a great danger, not only for Paul, but for all of us as well, if he comes here. For understanding this, we must remember that Paul was not unknown in Jerusalem. Quite the opposite was the case. He had lived in Jerusalem, and he had been a radical Jewish activist fighting the Christians. But meanwhile, he had switched sides. And for his former fellow fighters, he was now a traitor, a renegade. For them, he was a hated person. Therefore, the community in Jerusalem sent the prophet Agabus to Caesarea to convince Paul not to come to Jerusalem. But Paul insisted on going. He wanted that the community in Jerusalem stick to the former agreement and receive the delegation of communities who lived outside the Torah. That was the reason for him to go to Jerusalem. Otherwise, he could have left the money in Caesarea so that the community of Jerusalem could pick the money secretly and without giving any provocation to the Jewish side. No, that was no solution for Paul. Instead, Paul and the delegation went to Jerusalem. But they did not go alone. They were accompanied by members of the community of Caesarea Maritima. Jerusalem was not only the city of King David, it was also the city of Herod the Great, who had embellished it by building a new temple. He had also erected a palace as his residence in Paul's days, used by the Roman prefectors when he was in Jerusalem. Here we see the temple walls, the southwest corner of the temple platform. The huge blocks here, these here, are from the Herodian building. This is a so-called citadel, fortified towers, which were located directly adjacent to King Herod's palace. The palace has been destroyed in later centuries. The towers survived, were destroyed and rebuilt several times. Now we come to delivering the collection. Now things become complicated. Luke is still using the report of a delegate, but now he reworks it. At least we can assume that. We know that Luke is not interested in the collection. Therefore, we cannot expect him to tell us whether the collection was actually delivered or not. But the situation is not only complicated for the reader of today, the situation was complicated for Paul and his delegation as well. First of all, the delegation did not go directly to James and his community. They stayed in the house of, quotation, the old disciple Mnason from Cyprus, Acts 21:16, a Christian Jew from the diaspora, now residing in Jerusalem. In all probability, he was the contact person in Jerusalem for the Christians in Caesarea Maritima, and so by their connection, they could lead Paul and his delegation to him. It is noteworthy that Paul and the delegation were housed by this old disciple Mnason and not by the saints to whom they wanted to deliver the collection. It was only the next day that they met James and his community, and we can assume all things were rather complicated for the delegation, only from these facts. And then, when Paul and the delegation came to James and his community, the letter asked Paul to pay for a group of 4 young members of the community who had started a certain ritual closely connected with the temple. Acts 21, verse 23 and 4. Luke does not use any specific designation for this ritual, but it's undisputed in scholarship that this was the rite of the Nazirite vow. In most cases, this ritual lasted for 4 weeks, and at the end, several sacrifices were necessary. Paul was expected now to pay for these sacrifices. Luke does not say how Paul was able to pay for it, but most probably it was from the money of the collection. One may suppose that this was in some way an indirect way for delivering the collection. Paul, or the delegation, paying for the sacrifices would cause no danger for the community if they are paying for a pious Jewish ritual. But the community could save the money it otherwise had to spend for the sacrifices. We have there in Germany the word Umwegfinanzierung. I don't know whether somebody can understand it. So indirectly financing something. We do not know whether Paul was surprised by James' proposal. Luke does not tell the whole story, as I have already mentioned. It is possible that this was part of a deal made already in Caesarea Maritima before Paul and the delegation came to Jerusalem. Then this would have been the condition on which they were to be received in Jerusalem. In any case, Paul accepted to take part in the ritual and to pay for the sacrifices. For that reason, he entered the temple precinct, Acts 21, verse 26. Here, Jewish radical activists caused an incident blaming Paul to have violated the holiness of the temple. Paul was arrested by Roman soldiers, and soon after he was brought as prisoner to Caesarea Maritima, verse 23 and 35 in Acts. As Luke does not say anything about the collection, we do not know whether there was some money left after paying for the sacrifices, and how this money was delivered, if there was some money left. In any case, probably not publicly. This leads to the final question. Was the collection of Paul and his communities a success or a failure? The delivery of the collection comprised two aspects that were closely linked together. The first was the mutual acceptance of the communities founded by Paul and of the community in Jerusalem. The second was the confirmation of this mutual acceptance by delivering the collection in Jerusalem and its formal acceptance by the Jerusalem community. The second part, the delivery of the money, obviously failed. The political situation made a public transfer of the collection impossible. The first aspect, the mutual acceptance, could be realized after many difficulties. At last, the community in Jerusalem received Paul and the representatives of his communities. James and his community did not refuse an encounter with Paul and his delegation. So the Jerusalem Agreement of 49 was still valid, at last in principle. Judging from the expectation at the beginning of the collection project 3 years ago in Macedonia and Achaia, for Paul and his delegation, the result must have been in many aspects disappointing. Nevertheless, in my view, it is important to see how both sides tried to maintain their mutual relationship despite the many obstacles. I thank you for your patience.